Before we get started, have you got a full tank of gas? If you do, you may want to rethink that. Now, while Adam's removing the wheels and tires, it's a good time for some disclaimers and advice. Now, you do know that there's some qualified technicians out there that are willing and able to do this as a professional install, right? Yeah, this little project is doable on the ground, but it'd be a real pain, and cutting slag dripping into your midsection can be a little unpleasant. Also, if you'd like your Jeep to maybe start and run after the install, removing that negative battery cable is just good insurance. If you still have those rotor retaining clips on your Jeep, get rid of them. They just cause nothing but trouble. They get in the way of aftermarket wheel mounts and serve no useful purpose once the Jeep has left the assembly line. Save some time and remove the brake caliper and anchor bracket as an assembly. Use a 21mm. The caliper is heavy, so hang it so the weight isn't supported by that brake line. Get the transfer case skid plate out of the way. Use an 18mm. It's easy to remove and it'll gain you a little more access to that 8mm driveline bolt conglomerate. The driveline needs to be removed to allow the axle to drop without causing any CV joint damage. Remove the 4 15mm driveline bolts at the front diff and remove the driveline. Move to the rear driveline and remove those endless 8mm bolts. The rear pinion yoke has a couple of access holes to help with driveline removal. Use a punch and get the joint just loose enough for removal. But first, remove the front of the driveline from the transfer case. The front usually slides out pretty easy. Then finish working the joint loose from the rear axle and remove the driveline. Remove the remaining cross member near the transmission using an 18mm. We're going to start with the front axle by removing the sway bar links. Use an 18mm socket and a 19mm end wrench to hold the stud from spinning. Swing the sway bar out of your way. Adam jumps from the front to the rear axles as he removes each component because he already has the correct tools in his hands. Loosen the 21mm drag link nut at the knuckle, but do not remove. Adam is fond of his air hammer, but a good solid hit with a regular hammer will easily knock the rod end loose. The nut will protect the threads and body parts when the drag link finally breaks loose and drops. Tie the drag link up out of the way. To do this install, we are ultimately going to completely remove both the front and rear axles, exhaust, and fuel tank. Starting with the front track bar, use a 21mm and remove. Move to the rear track bar and use the same 21mm and remove it as well. Completely disconnect the park brake cables from the rear axle, as well as the support hangers on the floorboard. Use a 10mm and just discard the hanger. Use an 8mm and remove the rear wheel speed sensors. It's always a good idea to just start the bolt back into place for safekeeping. Move back to the front and remove the front wheel speed sensor. Now this one's a little more tricky, and it makes sensor removal much easier and saves sensor damage if we loosen the 3 13mm 12-point unit bearing bolts. This allows the backing plate to be moved out of the way and the sensor can be easily removed. Completely disconnect all harnesses and breathers from the housing, both on the front and the rear. By the way, if you have a Rubicon, you'll also need to disconnect the locker actuator as well as the sensor harness on both axles. Remove the rear shocks. Use an 18mm on the bottom and a 16mm at the top. Before removing the rear control arms, support the axle at the pinion as well as near the spring perches. Remove the upper and lower control arms on one side using a 21mm. Move to the other side and remove the remaining control arms. The jack stand should hold the axle in place. Lower the rear axle and remove the coil springs. The rear axle should now be completely free. Remove it from underneath the Jeep. Move to the front axle and support the axle at the pinion and at the axle tubes. On 2012 and newer Jeeps, the battery tray can limit access to that upper shock bolt. Just use a pair of pliers and break away the thin plastic on that battery tray to gain access. Adam removed the lower shock bolt using an 18mm and left the upper 16mm bolt in place. Why? Just because the Jeep was up in the air and he couldn't reach it. We'll get to it later. On 2012 and newer JKs, the front brake lines are long enough that they can be used on a lifted Jeep. Use a heel bar or even a pair of vice grips and spread the brake line retainer bracket to separate the brake line. Unbolt the now mangled bracket with a 10mm and discard. Remove the lower control arm using a 21mm. First, remove the heat shield on the upper control arm using a 10mm to gain access to the 18mm control arm bolts, and remove the control arm. Repeat the process on the other side. Lower the axle and remove the springs. We then lowered the Jeep enough to reach that upper shock mount and remove the shock. Remove the axles out from under the Jeep. Gas tank removal is really not that hard of a project, especially if you are clever enough not to have a full tank of gas. The gas tank skid plate has 8 18mm bolts. With the tank supported, remove them. Remove the fill neck, fuel lines, evap lines, and connectors. The 2 connectors are on top of the tank. All connectors are a squeeze and pull design. Quick release is probably an overstatement, but they will release. Carefully lower the tank and remove it away from the soon-to-be spark-filled zone around the Jeep. Reroute the brake line cables under the crossmember. This will allow for added axle dropout when that new lift is installed. Support the transfer case and remove the transmount crossmember. Use a 16mm to remove the 3 transmount bolts and an 18mm for the bolts at the frame side. If you remove all but one of the frame side bolts, the crossmember will just swing out of the way and it won't be necessary to completely remove it. We're removing the crossmember to gain access to the exhaust system. Having that exhaust system out of the way will be a blessing when you start cutting brackets. Remove the exhaust system by starting with the 4 13mm flange bolts. We're going to remove the exhaust system as an assembly, so hit all the exhaust system hangers with some silicone spray or even some penetrating oil if that's all you have around. It'll really help with removal. Use a pry bar to slide each of the hangers free for the exhaust and get some qualified help to help with lowering that exhaust system. With the exhaust system out of the way, swing the crossmember back into place to support the trans. This will allow us to get rid of that in-the-way jack stand. Turn all the frame side bolts around, installing them from the rear of the crossmember. The bolts will be used to index the new control arm brackets. Disconnect all 402 sensors, one white and one black connector on each side. To remove the catalytic converter from the head, remove the 10mm bolts at the top of the flange. The pipe will swing out of the way from the head and lift off. It's really a cool design. On the passenger or right side of the Jeep, pop loose the split loom harness and just tuck it up on top of the frame out of harm's way. On the driver's side, use a bungee cord and pull the heat shielded lines away from the frame. Now that may have seemed like a project to get everything out of the way, but with no exhaust system, fuel tank, or harnesses to worry about, you now have plenty of room to get serious with those frame brackets. Here's a quick guide as to where to make the bracket cuts. It's a good idea to mark your brackets so that when you're in the heat of the moment, you can have a good idea of where to cut. If you're doing this at home, it's not really necessary to completely clean off the upper brackets. Leaving the section that's actually welded to the frame isn't really a problem. It's just a preference thing. But if you ever roll your Jeep, your friends will be impressed if it's completely removed. If you make the cuts as clean as possible without punching holes in the frame, it will really speed up the final cleanup. When you start cutting brackets, you'll appreciate how cleanly Adam's able to do this. Once the front brackets on both sides are removed, move to the rear. The rear brackets are much easier to access if a small section of the fender liner is removed. Draw a line along the liner under the lower Christmas tree retainer as shown. If you have an aversion to trimming the fender liner, just go ahead and remove it. We'll wait. Adam is marking where he'll make his first cut. Again, he removes the bracket in sections for a clean final cut. A sharp box cutter or knife works well to trim the fender liner. Cut the bracket along your paint marks. With the outer section of the bracket out of the way, it's much easier to see where the bracket is welded to the frame. Make a small corner cut at the top of the frame to allow the hard-to-reach bracket enough flexibility to be pried up before cutting. This is one of those little leave-it-if-you-want brackets, but as long as it doesn't interfere with the new one, it shouldn't be a problem. By prying the section of the bracket away from the frame, it's much easier to make a clean cut. Caution, there are brake lines opposite your cut, so protect them from damage with a shield of some kind. The lower bracket can be removed as a big chunk or by splitting in half and then prying the sides away from the frame. This makes for a clean cut without frame damage. The outside of the lower bracket has a convenient body mount bracket in the middle of it. We fully trimmed the rear edge from the frame and left a little small section under the body mount. It's easier to work at removing the small section of bracket without the bulk of the entire bracket in the way. Don't be afraid to clean up as much of the frame as you need to make it look good and have it ready for welding. There is a rear bracket support brace that will need to be welded to the frame prior to the bracket install. This support will spread the bracket load and also provide frame strength. The hole in the frame brace will index with the existing frame hole. Throw a control arm bolt in the hole and clamp the plate into place. Tack weld in a few spots, and then final weld. Or, if the brace plate fits flush with the frame, say that fast, do a visual line up, tack weld, and then final weld. Always tack weld for a few spots around any brace or bracket before welding. It will help with bracket warpage caused by heat from welding. Once the plate is welded into place, do a quick slag cleanup in preparation for the new control arm bracket installation. Before installing the new frame brackets, the E-dip needs to be removed from along the side of the bracket edges at all the weld points. We marked the areas for cleaning. A clean bracket makes for a happy weld. This is an important step. Clean the coating back a good ½ inch from the edge of the bracket. Be sure to clean off the coating even along the edges of the bracket. Contamination makes for a weak weld. The open slots in the brackets need to be cleaned as well. They are designed as an additional weld point to eliminate bracket flex. Position the new bracket on the frame and do a quick test fit. Install the gas tank frame bolt that clamps the bracket to the frame. The plan is to press the bracket against the frame until all the edge gaps are reduced to a minimum. Gap welding is no fun. Be sure to spot weld the bracket to reduce heat warpage. Remove the 18mm body mount bolt to gain access to that hard-to-reach section of the bracket inside the body mount. The front brackets are pretty much the same drill. Clean off all the coating on the edges of the weld points along with the slots in the bracket. Again, they will be used as a plug weld to prevent flex. With the frame and brackets clean and ready to weld, position the new frame bracket using the 2 cross-member bolts to support and locate the bracket, and install the provided bolt into that lower control arm frame tab. Replace the cross-member bolts with the new longer hardware and tighten the bracket into place. Use clamps where required and tack weld the bracket into position, again to prevent that warpage. Don't be shy about welding. Final weld along all the edges and through the plug weld slots in the bracket. Prep the newly installed bracket for paint by buffing away any residual welding slag. Once it's cooled down and cleaned up, primer the frame and bracket, then follow up with some good paint. Move all the harnesses and frame brake lines back into position on the frame. Reinstall the body mount bolt that you removed to weld. Reinstall the fuel tank. There are a total of 7 connectors, hoses, and fill lines. Lift the tank back into place and reinstall the 8mm bolts using that 18mm. Moving to the front, reinstall the converters onto the heads and use a 10mm. Reconnect the 2 oxygen sensor plugs on each side. Make sure to reposition and lock into place all the frame harnesses. We removed the exhaust system as an assembly when the crossmember was out of the way. Well, the crossmember's back and it's bolted up, so removing that front crossmember section from the exhaust system is the best way to go. Loosen the exhaust clamp with a 17mm. Because we're installing exhaust spacers to gain additional driveline clearance, the exhaust system will need to shift to compensate for the additional length of the spacers. Long story short, we need to remove the small indexing button where the 2 sections of pipe slide together. A chisel and hammer will easily knock it off, but an air chisel is the ticket. Separate the front crossover section from the exhaust system and slide it in from the front of the crossmember. Install the exhaust spacers using the provided hardware. The spacers will gain some additional driveline clearance that will be needed due to the additional travel of the new suspension. Tighten with a 13mm once the pipe is in position. Before lifting the remaining section of exhaust into place, hit all of those hanger brackets with some lube. They can be tough to install. If you have an older exhaust system, it will really help to use some penetrating lube on the exhaust joint where the 2 sections of pipe slide together. When installing the rear section of pipe, be sure to push it in past the welding index button that we chiseled off. The exhaust system has been pushed back by the spacers, and this slip joint is used to compensate. Connect all of the exhaust hangers. Check for clearance around the exhaust system and final tighten the clamp on the joint using a 17mm. Break out the front lower control arms and adjust the flex joint out until you measure 34 inches on center. Make sure the flex joint is centered in the housing for a more accurate measurement. This is just going to give you a good starting point for arm adjustment. Final adjustment will be made on the alignment rack. The important thing is to make both arms the same length. To do that, we simply threw in a control arm bolt through both ends of the arms. If the bolt freely passes through the joints at both ends of the arms, they're the same length. Do the same with each pair of arms. The front uppers should measure about 27.5 inches. Measure on the inside of the bend with the bolt hole straight in the housing. The rear lower arms should measure about 35.25 inches. Rear uppers should measure 20 1/4 inches, again measuring on the inside of the bend with the flex joint properly oriented. Install the grease fittings into the flex joints in the arms, with easy access as well as protection from obstacles in mind. With the front axle supported under the Jeep, install the control arms. We started with the upper arms and loosely installed the nut and washer on the bolt. We'll do the same with all the arms and final tighten once the Jeep is on the ground and at ride height. If you're installing arms on a standard housing, you'll need to clearance the upper part of the axle control arm bracket to gain clearance for the fitting. Trust me, it will snap off when the Jeep is lowered to the ground. Or, just simply install the fitting on the bottom of the joint. Install a heavy-duty adjustable track bar with the adjusting sleeve closest to the axle. Now we're also installing a TeraFlex stabilizer shock relocation kit, so the axle side bolt has a shock mount stud there. Use the original track bar bolt if you missed out on the stabilizer relocation kit. Slide the provided spring spacer onto the jounce tube, followed by the factory isolator. You need that factory isolator to protect the harder spacer from damage. Install the coil spring. Install the front shocks using an 18mm on the bottom and a 16mm on the top. Move to the rear and reposition the axle under the Jeep. Start with the right lower arms, the rubber bushing to the frame, and loosely install the bolts and nuts. Install the upper arm on the same side, starting with the frame side bolt. 2 mounting holes provided in the new bracket. Using the 2 positions for adjustment, rear squat and anti-squat can be tuned. We usually start with the upper hole and make adjustments later if desired. Push the factory isolator onto the spring spacer. Use some grease or spray lube to help with install. And then push the upper spring spacer into the spring bucket. And then install the coil springs. On a stock axle, the left rear lower control arm shares the new track bar bracket with its mounting hole on the axle. Here is a link to the bracket install on a factory 44. On this install, we're using a Terra 60, so the bracket is already included on the axle. Install the rear shocks using an 18mm on the lower and a 16mm on the upper bolts. Reinstall the wheel speed sensors and brake caliper front and rear axles. Install the longer brake lines on the rear. Now if you didn't choose to install the Frenched-in speed bumps, make sure to push that hard line up against the frame so that the sway bar link will clear under flex. And install the new brake line bracket. Bleed the brakes. Reinstall the sway bar links with the stud pointed toward the frame and zip tie that brake line to the sway bar links for protection. Reinstall the drive lines, reconnect all the sensors, and give the Jeep a good once-over. just to make sure that there's nothing loose or any harnesses that could be damaged during flex. Don't forget to reinstall the TK skid plate using your trusty 18mm. Tighten all the arms and track bars once the Jeep is on the ground and at ride height. Have a good four-wheel alignment done by a shop that isn't afraid to drop a control arm to correct caster or even thrust angle. Enjoy your lift.